The envelope trembled in Jackson Cole's calloused hands as he stood in the lawyer's dusty office in Cheyenne, Wyoming, on a blistering July afternoon in 1883, wondering why a woman he had never met would name him in her final testament. The lawyer, a thin man named Silas Whitmore with spectacles perched on his narrow nose, cleared his throat and explained that Miss Eleanor Hartley had passed away 3 weeks prior, succumbing to consumption at the tender age of 24, and that she had left very specific instructions for Jackson to fulfill. Jackson removed his worn hat, running his fingers through his dark hair as confusion settled over his weathered face, because he could not recall ever meeting anyone by that name in all his 26 years of living. Silas adjusted his spectacles and began reading from the document in a measured tone that filled the small room with an air of solemnity and purpose. Eleanor Hartley had been the daughter of a wealthy cattle baron who owned land stretching across 3 counties, but she had lived most of her final years in isolation due to her illness, watching the world from her bedroom window and dreaming of all the things she would never experience. In her testament, she had requested that a faithful cowboy, someone honest and true, fulfill 3 specific wishes on her behalf, and she had chosen Jackson based on a recommendation from her father's foreman, who had witnessed Jackson return a lost herd to its rightful owner the previous winter, rather than claim it for himself. The first wish was simple, yet profound. Eleanor wanted wildflowers planted on the hill overlooking her family's ranch, a place where she had spent happy childhood days before illness confined her indoors. The second wish required Jackson to deliver letters she had written to 5 different people scattered across Wyoming and Colorado, letters containing words she had never been brave enough to speak while alive. The third and final wish was the most unusual. Eleanor had saved a considerable sum of money, and she wanted it used to help a young woman in need start a better life, someone who reminded Jackson of hope and possibility, someone who deserved a chance at the dreams Eleanor would never realize. Jackson accepted the task with a solemn nod, feeling the weight of responsibility settle across his broad shoulders like a heavy saddle blanket. Silas handed him a leather satchel containing the letters, a map marking the locations of the recipients, and a banknote worth $2,000, an amount that made Jackson's eyes widen because it represented more money than most cowboys would earn in 10 years of hard labor. The lawyer also provided him with a smaller envelope containing dried wildflower seeds and detailed instructions about where exactly Eleanor wanted them planted, written in delicate handwriting that spoke of careful thought and earnest hope. Jackson left the office and walked through the streets of Cheyenne, past the saloons and general stores, past the railroad station where steam engines hissed and clanged, until he reached the livery stable where his horse waited patiently in the afternoon heat. He secured the satchel to his saddle and mounted up, pointing his horse west toward the Hartley Ranch, which lay 2 days' ride through rolling prairie and rocky terrain. As he rode, he found himself thinking about Eleanor, this woman who had observed his actions from afar and trusted him with her final wishes, this stranger who had somehow seen something worthy in him when he often struggled to see it himself. The journey to the Hartley Ranch took Jackson through vast stretches of Wyoming grassland where antelope grazed and hawks circled overhead in the cloudless sky. He camped the first night beside a creek, cooking beans and salt pork over a small fire while studying Eleanor's instructions by flickering light. Her handwriting was elegant and precise, each letter formed with care, and he could sense her personality emerging from the page, thoughtful, detail-oriented, someone who had spent long hours alone with nothing but her thoughts and pen for company. The instructions for planting the wildflowers were remarkably specific, describing the exact spot on the hill where morning light would hit first and evening shadows would fall last. On the second day, Jackson reached the Hartley Ranch as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. The main house was an impressive structure built from timber and stone, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of wealth and careful management. He was greeted by the foreman, a grizzled man named Pete Hastings, who had known Eleanor since she was a child, and whose eyes grew misty when Jackson explained his purpose for visiting. Pete led Jackson to the hill Eleanor had described, a gentle slope covered in prairie grass that overlooked the entire valley where cattle grazed peacefully in the gathering dusk. Pete shared stories about Eleanor as they walked, painting a picture of a vibrant young girl who had loved riding horses and exploring the land before consumption had slowly stolen her strength and vitality. She had been engaged once to a banker's son from Laramie, but he had broken off the engagement when her illness became serious, unwilling to tie himself to someone whose future was so uncertain. The rejection had wounded Eleanor deeply, Pete explained, and she had spent her final years withdrawing from society, pouring her energy into correspondence and careful observation of the world she could no longer fully participate in. Jackson spent the next morning preparing the ground on the hill, working the soil with borrowed tools until it was ready to receive the seeds Eleanor had saved. Pete brought him water and food, staying to help with the heavier work despite his advancing years. They planted the wildflower seeds in careful rows and patterns, following Eleanor's detailed instructions exactly, creating what would eventually bloom into a living memorial visible from the house where she had spent so many lonely hours. As Jackson patted down the final section of soil, he felt a strange connection to this woman he had never met, a sense that he was honoring something sacred and important. With the first wish completed, Jackson prepared to embark on the second task, delivering Eleanor's letters to their intended recipients. Pete provided him with supplies and a fresh horse, insisting that Eleanor's estate could well afford to ensure her wishes were properly fulfilled. The first letter was addressed to Eleanor's younger sister, Catherine, who lived in Denver, Colorado, working as a teacher at a school for girls. The journey south would take Jackson through some of Wyoming's most beautiful and treacherous terrain, across mountain passes and through valleys where outlaws sometimes preyed on solitary travelers. Jackson rode for 5 days, pushing through a summer rainstorm that turned the trails to mud and camping in an abandoned line shack when the weather grew too severe for travel. He reached Denver on a Saturday morning, finding the city bustling with activity as miners and businessmen crowded the streets alongside ladies in fine dresses and children playing in the dusty roads. He located Eleanor Hartley at the boarding house where she rented a room, a young woman of 22 with the same delicate features and thoughtful eyes that Jackson imagined her sister must have possessed. Catherine's hands shook as she accepted the letter, and tears streamed down her face as she read her sister's final words in the privacy of the boarding house parlor. When she finished, she looked up at Jackson with gratitude shining through her grief, and explained that she and Eleanor had been estranged for nearly 2 years following a terrible argument about Catherine's decision to leave home and pursue teaching rather than stay and help care for her ailing sister. Eleanor's letter contained forgiveness and encouragement, urging Catherine to continue following her dreams and assuring her that the estrangement had been Eleanor's fault for allowing pride to overcome love. Jackson stayed in Denver only one night before continuing to the next destination, a ranch outside of Fort Collins where Eleanor's former fiancé now lived with his new wife and infant son. The letter for him was shorter, and Jackson felt reluctant to deliver it, sensing it might contain words of pain or recrimination. However, when he handed it to Thomas Brennan, the man who had abandoned Eleanor in her illness, he saw genuine remorse flood across the banker's son's face as he read. The letter did not contain anger or bitterness. Instead, Eleanor had written to release Thomas from any guilt he carried, explaining that she understood his choice and hoped he would find happiness in his new life. The remaining 3 letters took Jackson across Colorado and back into Wyoming, to a childhood friend who had moved away, to a former teacher who had encouraged Eleanor's love of literature, and to a minister who had visited her faithfully during her final months. Each delivery was met with tears and gratitude, each letter carefully crafted to bring comfort, closure, or encouragement to its recipient. Jackson began to understand Eleanor more deeply through these encounters, recognizing her as someone who had used her final days to mend relationships and spread whatever kindness she could from her confined world. By the time Jackson completed the second wish, summer was giving way to early autumn, and the aspens in the high country were beginning to turn gold and crimson. He returned to Cheyenne to report his progress to Silas Whitmore and to contemplate the third and most challenging wish: finding a young woman deserving of Eleanor's gift, someone who embodied hope and possibility, someone who needed a chance at a better life. Jackson had never been tasked with making such a significant decision, and the responsibility weighed heavily on his conscience as he considered how to identify the right person. He spent several days in Cheyenne, observing people and listening to stories, trying to discern who might be most worthy of Eleanor's generosity. He saw plenty of women struggling to make ends meet: laundresses, seamstresses, women working in restaurants and hotels, widows trying to support children on meager wages. However, Jackson wanted to be certain he made the right choice, honoring Eleanor's spirit and intention rather than simply giving money to the first person who appeared needy. It was during a visit to the general store that Jackson first encountered Abigail Morrison, and something in that moment felt like destiny aligning according to some unseen plan. Abigail was haggling with the store owner over the price of fabric, trying to stretch her limited funds to purchase material for winter clothing. She was perhaps 23 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and green eyes that held both determination and weariness. Her dress was clean but mended in multiple places, and her hands showed the roughness of someone accustomed to hard physical labor. Jackson learned Abigail's story over the following days as he made quiet inquiries around town and eventually worked up the courage to speak with her directly. She had come west from Missouri 2 years earlier with her father and younger brother, hoping to start a new life after her mother's death. Her father had intended to establish a freight business, but he had been killed in a wagon accident within 6 months of their arrival, leaving Abigail to support her 15-year-old brother Samuel while working as a cook at a boarding house. She dreamed of opening a restaurant someday, a proper establishment where she could use the recipes her mother had taught her, but such dreams seemed impossibly distant given her current circumstances. Jackson found himself drawn to Abigail's resilience and quiet strength. The way she never complained despite her obvious struggles, the way she smiled genuinely when speaking about her brother's education or her mother's memory. He began taking his meals at the boarding house where she worked, sitting at the long table with miners and railroad workers while stealing glances at Abigail as she moved efficiently through the kitchen. Their conversation started simply, with Jackson complimenting her cooking and Abigail thanking him with a tired but genuine smile that made something warm bloom in his chest. One evening after the dinner service had ended, Jackson asked if he might speak with Abigail privately, and she agreed with curious wariness, wiping her hands on her apron as they stepped onto the boarding house's back porch. The autumn air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Jackson struggled to find the right words, not wanting to offend or frighten her, finally deciding that honest directness was the best approach. He explained about Eleanor Hartley and her testament, about the 3 wishes and how he had completed the first 2, about the money intended for a young woman who deserved a chance at her dreams. Abigail listened with growing astonishment, her green eyes widening as Jackson described Eleanor's intention and his careful observation over the past week. When he finished speaking, Abigail shook her head slowly, disbelief written across her delicate features. She protested that she could not possibly accept such a gift from a stranger, that it did not seem proper or reasonable, that surely there were others more deserving of such extraordinary generosity. Jackson countered each objection patiently, explaining that Eleanor had specifically wanted someone who reminded him of hope and possibility, someone working hard to build a better future despite difficult circumstances. Over the following weeks, Jackson and Abigail spent increasing amounts of time together as they discussed how Eleanor's gift might best be used. Jackson insisted on no conditions or expectations, making clear that the money was Abigail's to use as she saw fit. But Abigail wanted to ensure she honored the spirit of Eleanor's wish by using it wisely and purposefully. They walked through Cheyenne streets as summer faded completely into autumn, discussing possibilities and plans while leaves crunched under their feet, and their conversations gradually shifted from practical matters to personal histories and shared hopes. Jackson told Abigail about his childhood on a small ranch in Kansas, about losing his parents to fever when he was 17, about the years spent drifting from job to job across the frontier, working as a ranch hand and trail driver, never finding a place that felt like home. Abigail shared memories of Missouri, of her mother's gentle teaching and her father's big dreams, of the heartbreak of losing them both and the responsibility of caring for Samuel while trying to keep her own dreams alive. They discovered shared values and compatible temperaments, finding comfort in each other's company that went beyond mere friendship. Abigail decided to use Eleanor's gift to open her restaurant, a decision that filled Jackson with satisfaction and growing affection. They found a suitable property on a corner lot near the center of town, a building that had formerly housed a dry goods store but had stood empty for months. With Jackson's help, Abigail negotiated a reasonable purchase price and began the work of transforming the space into her vision. Jackson found himself volunteering his time freely, arriving each morning to help with repairs and renovations, building new tables and counters, painting walls, and fixing a leaky roof. Samuel, Abigail's brother, joined them after his school day ended, a lanky youth with his sister's auburn hair and a quick smile that reminded Jackson of himself at that age. The three of them worked together through late autumn, their partnership deepening into something that felt like family. Jackson taught Samuel carpentry skills, while Abigail planned menus and ordered supplies, her excitement growing as the restaurant took shape around them. During those long days of physical labor and shared purpose, Jackson realized he was falling in love with Abigail, drawn to her kindness and determination, her resilience and grace. He kept his feelings private at first, uncertain whether Abigail might view his attention as an obligation tied to Eleanor's gift or whether she might share his growing attachment. However, small moments revealed the truth. The way Abigail's face lit up when he arrived each morning, the way her hand would linger on his arm when she thanked him for his help, the way her laughter came more freely in his presence. One evening as they painted the restaurant sign together, their hands touched while reaching for the same brush, and the electric current that passed between them spoke volumes that words could not capture. Jackson finally confessed his feelings on a cold November night as the first snow began to fall across Cheyenne. They were standing in the completed restaurant admiring their work by lamplight when Jackson took Abigail's paint-stained hand and told her plainly that he had fallen in love with her, that she had become the dream he had not known he was searching for across all those drifting years. Abigail's eyes filled with tears as she admitted her own feelings, explaining that she had tried to resist because she feared he might be acting from duty rather than genuine affection, but that her heart had made its own choice regardless of her careful reasoning. They married in December, a simple ceremony at the town church with Samuel standing as Jackson's best man and Catherine Hartley traveling from Denver to serve as Abigail's witness. Catherine was delighted to learn how her sister's final wish had brought Jackson and Abigail together, seeing Eleanor's hand in a romance that had blossomed from an act of generosity and faith. The wedding was small but joyful, attended by friends they had made during the restaurant's renovation and by Pete Hastings, who had ridden down from the Hartley Ranch to represent Eleanor's family and give their union his blessing. Abigail's restaurant opened in January 1884, quickly establishing a reputation for excellent food and warm hospitality. Jackson continued working as a cowboy during the busy seasons, hiring on with local ranches for roundups and cattle drives, but he always returned to Cheyenne and to Abigail, to the home they were building together. Samuel thrived under Jackson's mentorship, learning skills and gaining confidence that transformed him from a worried boy into a capable young man. The three of them formed a family unit bound not by blood alone, but by choice and commitment and shared experience. In the spring, Jackson returned to the Hartley Ranch to check on Eleanor's wildflower hill, bringing Abigail with him so she could see where their unexpected story had begun. The hillside had transformed into a riot of color: purple lupine, yellow black-eyed Susans, red Indian paintbrush, and white daisies swaying in the breeze, creating exactly the living memorial Eleanor had envisioned. Pete was maintaining the flowers faithfully, ensuring they were watered during dry spells and protected from grazing cattle. As Jackson and Abigail stood hand in hand looking across that brilliant display, They both felt Eleanor's presence and the beauty surrounding them, her spirit alive in the love she had helped create. Abigail suggested they honor Eleanor's memory by establishing a tradition. Each year, they would identify someone struggling to achieve their dreams and offer assistance, carrying forward the generosity that had changed their lives. Jackson agreed wholeheartedly, recognizing this as a perfect way to ensure Eleanor's legacy continued growing and spreading like the wildflowers on her hillside. They began modestly, helping a widow purchase supplies for her seamstress business, but the tradition would grow over the years into something significant and lasting. Their first child was born in November 1884, a healthy boy they named Cole Hartley Morrison, honoring both Jackson's surname and Eleanor's memory. Abigail proved to be a strong mother, managing both the restaurant and motherhood with remarkable grace, while Jackson discovered that fatherhood unlocked depths of emotion he had not known he possessed. Holding his son in the quiet hours before dawn, Jackson would think about Eleanor and the chain of events she had set in motion, grateful beyond words for a dying woman's faith in a cowboy she had never met. The restaurant flourished as Cheyenne grew, becoming a gathering place for the community where ranchers and businessmen, families, and travelers all found welcome and excellent meals. Abigail expanded the menu over time, incorporating dishes from various culinary traditions she learned from customers and from cookbooks Jackson brought her from his travels. Samuel eventually became Abigail's business partner, taking over much of the day-to-day management as he grew into a skilled young man, allowing Abigail more time with her growing family. Jackson and Abigail had 3 more children over the following years, a daughter named Eleanor in 1886, twin boys in 1889. Their home was filled with laughter and love, with the sounds of children playing and the smells of Abigail's cooking, with everything Jackson had never dared to hope for during his drifting years. He took his role as father seriously, teaching his children about honesty and hard work, about keeping promises and honoring commitments, about the woman named Eleanor Hartley whose final wishes had brought their family into existence. Each summer, the entire family would travel to the Hartley Ranch to see Eleanor's wildflower hill in full bloom. The children would run through the flowers while Jackson and Abigail sat in the grass, remembering and giving thanks. Pete Hastings aged into retirement, but the new foreman maintained the tradition of caring for the hillside, understanding it was sacred ground in its own way. Catherine visited from Denver when her teaching schedule allowed, delighted to watch Eleanor's legacy growing in ways her sister could never have fully imagined. The tradition of helping others that Jackson and Abigail had established grew more formal over time. As the restaurant's success increased their financial stability, they set aside funds specifically for assisting people with dreams that needed support. They helped a young couple purchase land for farming, funded education for promising students whose families could not afford tuition, provided loans for small business ventures that traditional banks would not risk supporting. Word of their generosity spread gradually, and people began coming to them with requests which Jackson and Abigail carefully evaluated together, looking for that same spark of hope and determination Eleanor had wanted to nurture. Years passed with the steady rhythm of seasons and the gradual accumulation of memories that formed a rich and meaningful life. Jackson's dark hair acquired streaks of silver, and Abigail's face gained the lines that came from years of smiling and laughter. Their children grew and began establishing their own paths. Cole showed interest in ranching, Eleanor inherited her mother's culinary talents, the twins developed complementary skills in business and carpentry. Samuel married and had children of his own, expanding the family further while remaining closely involved in the restaurant that bore his sister's vision. Jackson never forgot that afternoon in Silas Whitmore's office when he had first learned of Eleanor Hartley and her testament. The moment had seemed confusing and burdensome then, an obligation he accepted from duty rather than desire. However, it had become the pivot point of his entire life, the moment when his drifting existence found direction and purpose. Eleanor had seen something in him worth trusting, some quality of faithfulness and honor that Jackson himself had not fully recognized, and in living up to her faith, he had discovered his best self. On their 20th wedding anniversary in December 1904, Jackson and Abigail stood together in the restaurant they had built from Eleanor's gift and their shared labor. The space was warm and welcoming, filled with customers who had become friends over 2 decades. Their children were grown, or nearly so, Samuel's family thriving, the tradition of generosity they had established still growing stronger each year. Jackson looked at his wife, still beautiful despite the years and the hard work, and marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. Abigail squeezed his hand and smiled, that same genuine expression that had first captured his heart all those years ago. They did not need words to communicate their gratitude for Eleanor and for each other, for the life they had built from tragedy and hope. Outside, snow was falling gently across Cheyenne, covering the streets in white and promising a beautiful winter. Inside, the restaurant glowed with warmth and light, with the sounds of conversation and laughter, with the tangible evidence of dreams fulfilled. Jackson thought about Eleanor's 3 wishes and how faithfully he had tried to honor them. The wildflowers still bloomed each summer on her hillside, a riot of color visible for miles. The letters had been delivered, bringing comfort and closure to their recipients, mending relationships and easing burdens, and the money given to help a young woman achieve her dreams had multiplied beyond anything Eleanor could have anticipated, creating not just a successful business, but an entire family, a tradition of generosity, a legacy of love and hope that continued expanding outward like ripples on still water. As Christmas approached that year, the family gathered at Jackson and Abigail's home, now a substantial house they had purchased as their family grew. The children decorated with pine boughs and strings of popcorn, filling the rooms with the scents and sounds of the season. Samuel brought his wife and children, and Catherine traveled from Denver, where she had become head mistress of her school. They shared a feast that Abigail and Eleanor prepared together, mother and daughter working side by side in comfortable harmony. After dinner, Jackson told the story he told every Christmas, how a dying woman had trusted a cowboy she had never met, how that trust had led him to a woman who became his wife, how faithfulness to a testament had created everything they now cherished. The younger children had heard the story many times, but still listened with rapt attention, understanding it was part of their family's foundation. The older children and adults reflected on how one person's generosity could echo through time, touching lives in ways impossible to predict or measure. That night, after the guests had departed and the house had quieted, Jackson and Abigail sat together by the fire, speaking softly about the past and the future. Their grandchildren would carry forward the story of Eleanor Hartley and her testament, teaching their own children about faithfulness and generosity, about honoring commitments and helping others achieve their dreams. The legacy would continue growing, spreading further with each passing generation, all because a sick young woman had looked beyond her own suffering to imagine a better future for someone she would never meet. Jackson pulled Abigail close, feeling the warmth of her body against his, grateful for every moment of their 20 years together and for however many years remained ahead. He had been a faithful cowboy, honoring Eleanor's testament to the best of his ability, but the reward had far exceeded any reasonable expectation. He had found not just purpose, but love, not just obligation, but family, not just duty, but joy that filled every corner of his life. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the comfortable room. Outside, stars blazed in the cold December sky above Wyoming, the same stars that had looked down on Eleanor during her final days, the same stars that would continue shining long after everyone now living had passed into memory. But the love Jackson and Abigail shared, the family they had built, the tradition of generosity they had established, these would persist through their children and grandchildren, a testament to one woman's final wishes and one cowboy's faithful determination to honor them. As sleep began to claim him that night, Jackson's last thoughts were of gratitude for Eleanor's inexplicable faith in him, for Silas Whitmore's summons to that dusty office so many years ago, for every step of the journey that had led to this moment of profound contentment. He had made sure Eleanor's dreams came true by fulfilling her wishes, but in the process she had given him dreams of his own, dreams that had blossomed into a reality more beautiful than anything he could have imagined during those drifting years before everything changed. The testament had been honored. The faithful cowboy had completed his tasks, and in doing so, he had discovered that the greatest reward for keeping faith with the dead was the abundant life it created for the living. Jackson and Abigail drifted into sleep in each other's arms, secure in their love, grateful for their family, at peace with their past, and hopeful for their future. The embodiment of Eleanor Hartley's final gift to a world that had given her so little time but to which she had given so much.